Good evening, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind Online. Tonight, we're hosting Jhumpa Lahiri. She'll be talking about her new bestseller, Whereabouts. I'm Ariel Zeitlin. I'm one of the librarians at Montclair Public Library. And first, I need to tell you a little bit about the controls. It's really just the Q&A button. And if you're using a computer or a smartphone, it'll be at the bottom of your screen. And if you're using a tablet, it'll be at the top of your screen. So that's how you'll send us the questions for the Q&A. And it's also how you'll be communicating with my tech co-host, Molly Hone, if by any chance you're having problems logging on or hearing something or something like that. Now I'd like to introduce Irina Goldstein, a member of our library foundation board. Welcome, Irina.
Thank you. We're so happy that you're all here for another virtual Open Book, Open Mind. I welcome everyone on behalf of the foundation. We are a group of friends and neighbors whose mission is to raise money to fund the programs that make the Montclair Library so special. These programs include this one: staff development, building restoration, and other needs that are not covered by city funding. Your donation supports so many fantastic programs, including laptop lending and Wi-Fi hotspots for Montclair residents without internet access, delivery of materials to homebound seniors, the children's reading programs, and most recently, the significant growth in e-content during the pandemic. Please make a donation through our website, montclairplf.org. Gifts of all sizes have an impact, and the library needs your support now more than ever. Thank you very much for your consideration and patience. Please enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Irina, for all that you do. And if anyone in the audience wants to contribute to the library in other ways, please search Friends of the Montclair Public Library on our website or on Facebook. And now I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our guest of honor tonight, Jhumpa Lahiri. Jhumpa is an internationally best-selling, award-winning novelist celebrated for her polished and insightful prose style. She was born in London to parents of West Bengali origin and raised in Rhode Island. Jhumpa's debut collection of stories, Interpreter of Maladies, won the Pulitzer Prize and the Penn Hemingway Award. Her novels, The Namesake and the Lowland, were also critically acclaimed international bestsellers. Jhumpa lives in the New York area, frequently visits Rome, and is the chair of the creative writing department at Princeton University. Welcome, Jhumpa.
Thank you so much, Ariel. It is a great pleasure to be here. I am sort of down the road in Princeton, and I wish I could be in Montclair in person. I would just like to say to everybody who's out there, as someone whose very first job was in my hometown public library, and it was a transformative place for me, especially as a young girl. Please do contribute to your public library, to this public library.
Thank you so much, Jhumpa. We really appreciate that. Whereabouts was just published last week on April 27th, and it's already on the New York Times bestseller list. It's available to borrow from the library or to buy from our partner, Watchung Booksellers in Montclair, New Jersey. If you did purchase a book with your ticket, please contact the store to arrange pickup or shipping. Now, I'm also happy to introduce Jhumpa's conversation partner, Kate Tuttle. Kate is the interim books editor of the Boston Globe and a judge for the National Book Award. Kate's articles and book reviews have also appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Salon, to name just a few. She's also a member of the Open Book, Open Mind Advisory Board and a tireless booster of bookstores and libraries. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Jhumpa, welcome. I wanted to start by asking you to read a small section of the book. And as I assume everybody here already knows, this is a book that you wrote first in Italian, has been published in Italian, and have translated into English. So I would love it if you could read a section first in Italian and then in English.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Kate, and thank you. Thank you for being here tonight to talk with me about the book. So I'll just read from the very first chapter, which is brief, and it's called Sul marciapiede in Italian, and that means on the sidewalk. I'll read the Italian first and then move on to the English. Sul marciapiede. Al mattino, dopo colazione, supero una piccola lapide di marmo appoggiata contro il muro alto della strada. Non ho mai conosciuto il morto, eppure con gli anni conosco il suo nome, il cognome. So il mese e il giorno della sua nascita e della scomparsa. È morto quest'uomo 2 giorni dopo il suo compleanno, a febbraio. Deve essere stato un incidente in bici o in moto, oppure camminava di notte, sbadato. Forse è stato investito in pieno. Ha perso la vita a 44 anni. È mancato, mi immagino, proprio qui, su questo marciapiede, accanto al muro da cui spuntano delle piante trascurate, per cui la lapide si trova in basso, ai piedi dei passanti. È una strada serpeggiante, in salita, un po' pericolosa. Il marciapiede è scomodo, emergono le radici degli alberi. Certi tratti sono quasi impraticabili per via di quelle radici. Infatti, anch'io tendo a camminare in mezzo alla strada. Di solito c'è una candela accesa in un contenitore di vetro rosso, insieme a un piccolo mazzo di fiori e la statuetta di un santo. Nessuna foto però di lui. Sopra la candela, attaccata al muro, c'è una nota scritta a mano dalla madre, protetta da un involucro smunto di plastica. Un saluto a quelli che si fermano un attimo per riflettere sulla scomparsa del figlio. Sarei felice di ringraziare personalmente chi dedica qualche momento del suo tempo a mio figlio, ma se non sarà possibile, ringrazio comunque con tutto il cuore, c'è scritto. Non ho mai visto né la madre né nessun altro davanti alla lapide. Penso tanto alla madre quanto al figlio, poi continuo, sentendomi un pochino meno viva. So that was in Italian. And this is in English. On the sidewalk. In the mornings after breakfast, I walk past a small marble plaque propped against the high wall flanking the road. I never knew the man who died, but over the years I've come to know his name, his surname. I know the month and day he was born and the month and day his life ended. This was a man who died 2 days after his birthday, in February. It must have been an accident on his bike or his motorcycle. Or maybe he was walking at night, distracted. Maybe he was hit by a passing car. He was 44 when it happened. I suppose he died in this very spot, on this sidewalk, next to the wall that sprouts neglected plants, which is why the plaque has been arranged at the bottom, at the feet of passers-by. The road is full of curves and snakes uphill. It's a bit dangerous. The sidewalk is vexing, crowded with exposed tree roots. Some sections are nearly impossible to negotiate because of the roots. That's why I too tend to walk on the road. There's usually a candle burning in a container of red glass, along with a small bunch of flowers and the statue of a saint. There's no photograph of him. Above the candle, attached to the wall, there's a note from his mother, written by hand, encased in a milky plastic sleeve. It greets those who stop for a moment to ponder the death of her son. I would like to personally thank those who dedicate a few minutes of their time to my son's memory. But if that's not possible, I thank you anyway, from the bottom of my heart," it says. I've never seen the mother or any other person in front of the plaque. Thinking of the mother just as much as the son, I keep walking, feeling slightly less alive.
Thank you so much. That is such a beautiful chapter and such an intriguing way to enter this book and this world. I'd love to talk a little bit at first about the process of writing the book. You wrote in an essay published in the New Yorker about learning Italian, about your lifelong fascination with Rome and the kind of transformative experience it is to learn a new language. But you also write that it wasn't an overnight thing. You took lessons from several teachers in the United States before you moved to Rome with your family. And you found yourself at first quite at sea when you got there. But then you began writing in your diary in Italian. Tell us a little bit about that process and that moment when you began to write in Italian.
Well, it was a long process. It had many phases, many movements. But the critical movement was literally moving to Rome. And before then, I had never written anything in Italian. I tried, actually. I would try to write letters in Italian when I was still living in the United States and studying Italian diligently. But, they weren't very coherent or correct. But the strange thing that happened when I moved to Rome was that within a week, I shifted in my diary from writing in English to Italian, and that has never stopped. So that happened in August of 2012. So going on, well, it'll be 9 years this August. And that's a long time to be talking to myself in my diary to begin with in another language. And from that very private Italian writing, I started to emerge very, with a lot of misgivings and fear, but also something was pushing me to do it, obviously. And so I started to write. I started to write things, little sketches, pieces, observations. Then one day I sat down. That first year I was in Rome in the autumn. I had been living there for a few months, and a whole story came out, a whole story in Italian, which was eventually folded into the book In Altre Parole, which is the original of In Other Words. And so after I wrote that story, I was so bewildered and really puzzled and fascinated at the same time, sort of what's going on here. I didn't expect this to happen. I wasn't thinking, I wasn't setting out to do this. I mean, I was studying Italian for many years, but I wanted to study it so that I could speak Italian, so that I could communicate, so that I could express myself. That was about it. And read Italian. These were my objectives. I never thought about writing in Italian, but then that happened as well. So it was an overwhelming, experience for me, and a very, because I'm a writer, it just, the stakes were so high, for me personally.
Yeah, because of course you began your career as a writer in English, and you've had great success as a writer in English. You wrote in that same essay about learning Italian that you always had conflicts in your relationship to English, that you wrote you were afraid it might mean a break between you and your parents, that it was sort of it wasn't their language, and yet then you begin again. Does it feel like beginning anew as a writer when you write in a new language? And how different are you as a writer in Italian than the writer you are in English? Are these different writers?
they're very different writers. They're also obviously the same writer, me, but they feel different and they are different. I mean, I think when I started writing in Italian, I had to learn how to write all over again in a way. I mean, it's really hard to explain because obviously I had a foundation. I had written for many, many years in English. I knew how to build stories, or I was familiar with the work of building stories, building characters, things like that. Even though really every time you write a book in any language, it's a new mountain to climb, so even if you've done it before, it's still a major undertaking. That's how it feels to me. It doesn't make it easier, just makes it more familiar in some sense, the effort. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the voice was very different. That first story I wrote, which in English it's called The Exchange, I just didn't know where that voice was coming from. Clearly it was coming in through Italian, but it was a new voice and it was a new approach. The prose had a different energy. And I was intrigued by it. I mean, I was both sort of, what is that? And also, what is that? I was curious. I was really curious about what was coming out and onto the pages of my notebook in the Italian language. It felt very different, and I wondered if it could take me somewhere new and unexpected. And so I stayed with it.
Do you still write in Italian in your diary?
I do. Yeah.
Wow. So the book you wrote in Italian that became Whereabouts is published in Italian, and it's called Dove mi trovo, I think, something. So I don't speak Italian. So, but when you published it in Italian, you weren't certain that you would be the person to translate it into English. Obviously, your work has been translated out of English into many different languages, and Dove mi trovo was translated into other languages as well. But you write in an essay about translating it that you ultimately decided to take it on yourself after another translator had done some pages. You saw that it could be done. But in the essay, you compare the process to a surgeon performing an operation on herself. And you talk about that there's pain involved in translating yourself, the pain of seeing your writing exposed so harshly to yourself. How painful was it? And what did you learn about yourself as a writer in this process of translating yourself?
Well, on the granular level, I learned so many things. On the granular level, I really learned about how I was building sentences. I learned about words I would lean on more than other words. I learned about how I was dealing with punctuation. I mean, I really had a very, I was forced to reckon with every choice I made on the page, which is something I had never done before, ever, with anything I've written. I mean, you write something, you go over it, you pore over the pages, the galleys, whatever, you read it out loud. I do all of those things before any book is published, but then I really do just put it out of my mind. So with this book, I had already done all of that with the Italian publication, needless to say. I mean, I wrote it in Italian, I pored over every word, it went into proofs. I read the first set of galleys, the second set of galleys, I read it out loud, I read it out loud a second time. I was as close to it as I thought I could get before letting it go, putting it out there, and I did. But then a year after its publication, I had to go all the way back and re-engage with the book in a way that, certainly was the first time I had done that. And so it is like a form of, it's something that you think you should trust somebody else to do, because I asked myself, do I have the perspective? Do I
Mhm.
am I the right person? Because it is an operation, it's
Yeah.
literally an operation to translate something. It's messy, and it's delicate, and and there are grave consequences if you don't do it right, if you don't get it, if you hit it wrong. There are so many factors that go into a translation, and so it doesn't surprise me that many authors who move into other languages just move and then don't want to go back to the work, don't want to re-engage with it. Others do and did, and there were those examples as well to consider. Beckett probably being the biggest one for me, in terms of a reader, and sort of thinking about him over the decades and what he had done, moving into French and then out again. So yeah. So anyway, I decided to try, and it was intense. It was disorienting, but it was also very illuminating, and enabled me to really accept the book I had written in a fundamental way, and not sort of say, okay, bye, off to the next thing. I couldn't do that. I had to go back.
How great was the temptation to fix things up? I mean, I know you wrote that you did fix a few things up. You found obvious, things you needed to fix for the next edition in Italian. But were you tempted to rewrite sections after, I mean, did you have to separate yourself from the writer from the translator at that point?
Well, I definitely had to separate the writer from the translator. So when I was translating the book, the translator was sort of, driving the car, and the writer was in the passenger seat, and because the translator has to hold the reins or the steering wheel, in case I'm now mixing all of my metaphors, but in any case, she has to be in control, right? And the quote unquote original text, which in my case, I'm not sure how much that word even holds water after what I've done, but it has to literally take a back seat, because the translation, all of the energy has to go into the translation, into the new work that's being made, the work that's being remade. But so I had to, and I felt that, I mean, the person who wrote Dove mi trovo wrote, thought and heard and wrote a book in Italian, right? And the person who was translating that book was a person who was privileging her English ear and brain and familiarity with the English language and with English words and with English expressions. But I really didn't change anything significant, right? And I think if someone does ever really do a study sort of line by line of the Italian to the English, yes, there are things that I changed, that I had to change in English, because they wouldn't have worked otherwise. They wouldn't have had meaning, in my opinion. They wouldn't have had the clearest meaning possible, or they wouldn't have had resonance. They would have maybe felt a little flat or opaque. And so I thought, I thought I should work kind of on very specific cases with a couple of words, a couple of sentences where, there's wordplay in the Italian version. I couldn't automatically replicate that in English, because that's not how translation works. That's not how the translation of a literary text works. And so there were spots that I decided to, address individually, but on the whole, I didn't really alter the structure of the book at all. I didn't, every episode is the same. The same things happen. They're the same ingredients. Every paragraph, there's the same content, if you will. In that sense, I was very true to the book I had originally written.
One of the challenges you mention is just translating the title of the book. Dove mi trovo isn't exactly the same as whereabouts. You had to figure out what's the word in English that gets me closest to what I was thinking about, or gets me closest to the right title for this book. How does that process work for people who haven't done translation? It isn't word for word, as you say. You have to find the right solution for all these questions.
Yeah. So with Dove mi trovo, this reflexive verb, reflexive verbs are very common in Italian and in other Romance languages, right? So you're always, washing yourself or, whatever. And in this case, finding yourself, trovarsi is the verb. And it's a verb that is beautifully layered, because it can refer to finding yourself spatially, geographically, in a place, but it can also be, it can refer to, finding your kind of emotional coordinates or your state of mind, and that's something that doesn't come across if I were to have literally translated the book as where I find myself. The other thing is that in the Italian, even though the title doesn't have a question mark, there is ambiguity, because dove mi trovo can be a question as well. It can be a statement, dove mi trovo, where I am, where I find myself, or a question, dove mi trovo, where am I? And that idea of the interrogative is very germane to the book, I think, and to the character who is questioning her place in the world, right? And so I thought a lot about how to manage this title in English, how to suggest that similar richness, I think, that is already built into the Italian title. And so in the end, I decided on this word, whereabouts, which I really like in the English language. And I think it also is both a statement and a question, and it also, I think, is a very open-ended word. It has a broadness to it, a capaciousness that I thought was appropriate to this story.
Yeah, and it's it has a little built-in ambiguity, as you say, just like the Italian, which makes a lot of sense. One of the other translation challenges you write about, and it's even a footnote in the book, is the Italian for jewelry box, which is so fascinating because the word for jewelry in Italian, or for jewel, is the same as the word for joy. And so jewelry box has a lot of layers of meaning in Italian that it really doesn't in English.
Right.
Why did you decide to put in a footnote there? I mean, it's not a book with a lot of footnotes. There are 2 footnotes or 2 endnotes, but that one you wanted to explain to readers. Why?
Well, I didn't at first. And in fact, I really didn't want to use any, I didn't want to resort to notes. I thought there's got to be a way to figure it out and to make something of it. But what I realized is, so I translated the novel. I had a first go, and then I set it aside and I didn't think about it for a while. And I shared it with some readers. I got some feedback in English. I think I even delivered it to Knopf as in that state. And then they sent it back to me, and there was, we started to do copy editing, things like that. And I realized I had left the entire sentence out, because it was like driving down the road and you just see this huge obstacle, right? And you just it's like, well, I can't deal with that. I have to turn off, I have to get there some other way. I cannot drive down the road. Cannot drive down this road in this spot. So I just skipped it, and I went on. And so then I realized, I must have, obviously I skipped it for a reason, because I just wanted to move forward and get to the end. So then I had to really stop and think about it. And I think I spent, a couple of days thinking about how to deal with the mention of the portagioie, which is the jewelry box in question. And what happens in the book is that the protagonist, the Italian protagonist, she's an Italian speaker, right? So that's all we know about her identity, is that she's an Italian speaker. And she says, she mentions her portagioie, she mentions her jewelry box. And then she says, just kind of throws off, come to think of it, the most beautiful word there is, right? That's what she says in Italian. And if you are an Italian reader, if you're a reader of Italian, of course, you don't have to be Italian to read Italian. But if you are a reader of Italian, you'll understand, you will understand why this character thinks that, because it is a beautiful word. It's a beautiful word with poetry built into it, because of this wonderful double meaning of gioia, meaning jewel, and joy. And so I thought and I thought, and in the end, I did have to kind of adjust it in the English. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll just put a little note, just a tiny one-line note to say, well, because there's this double meaning, joy, jewel. But then I kind of got into it, and I thought, well, if I'm going to make a note, I might as well give a full note, or not an exhaustive note, but enough so that the reader who is curious can look at it and think about it and maybe learn something. And if you don't want to, it's also quite fine. I mean, it's not, I hope it's not, a burdensome element in the book. But I did decide, I think the linguist in me decided, I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to give a little lesson here, tiny lesson.
I
got the word.
I can imagine a lesson on every page if you had wanted to. You could go through and say, well, this was the challenge, in this scene, and this. I mean, it is. English and Italian are such very different languages, and you talk about the musicality of the word for jewelry box, and of course in English it kind of falls with a thud. Jewelry box. It's not very pretty. Is it difficult to translate from one language that does have this kind of poetry built into it to a language that's much more, I don't know how to describe English. I don't know how to look at English from the outside, because I'm just an English speaker, but it feels much more stolid and clunky and less musical to me.
Well, I would disagree. I think English is a beautiful language and has its own musicality. Of course it does. And if it weren't, how could all of this extraordinary poetry come from the English language? How could beautiful novels that, changed my life because I read them in English, how could they have come to be written? So, and maybe, I don't know. I mean, I do, I have spoken English for most of my life and know it very well, but I still came to it from the outside. I didn't have that same kind of relationship with the language that perhaps you did, right? And it was always the other language for me, and maybe that distance also enables me to preserve a kind of awe for it. But I think that the key is to take the musicality of the Italian and try to, create music in English as well. So I hope that the English version has its own musicality. It won't be the same musicality because, you know, in Italian, so many of the words end in vowels, for example. So already it's just the nature of the language is very different, you know, and I can tell just when I speak, and you know, just from the reading. I mean, the mouth works in a different way. Everything is different, and I know that from growing up speaking to other languages, throughout my life, and so that's my feeling, is that, you know, I mean, because there is beauty in really every language, I imagine, because there are poets in every language, and poets find that beauty, and they emphasize that beauty, right?
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. No, good point. One of the things that is intriguing about the book is how little we learn about the main character, even though we're right inside her head. It's, you know, it's narrated in the first person. She's very present, and yet we don't know her name. We don't know where she's. Well, we know where she's from. She's from where she lives. She's in her 40s. She's single. She has no kids. We know she has a difficult relationship with her mother. But the other things we know about her tend to be, we learn as we read the book about the habits of her mind. We learn that she's an observer, that she's accustomed to being alone, that she enjoys being alone, although she has friends. I'm curious, and I know, of course, the main character is not the author, but I'm wondering if this writing about an observer owes something to your own experiences of being an observer in a new city and a new country and a new language.
Well, I think it goes back to just my entire life as an observer. I don't think I've ever been anything but an observer. And I know I was formed as an observer and a listener from my very earliest memories in this country. My earliest memories date back to the United States. I don't remember being 1 or 2 years old in London. But I do remember being 3 and 4 in the United States, and my memories begin at that point, you know, in bits and pieces, and then more coherence. And I was always watching, and I think that watchfulness did make me a writer. You know, that's why I became a writer. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I became a writer, was because I was always sort of sitting quietly, listening and watching other people do things, say things, want things, and I loved hearing people tell stories about whatever, about themselves, about their day. I still do. I still love hearing people tell stories, and I listen to people when they tell me stories, and I take them in. And, you know, I think writers are like repositories in some sense. You know, they just accumulate experience, not just their own experience, but the experience of others. And this is much of what the writer does. The writer, yes, the writer sits down, the writer writes, you know, there's that work of writing, but actually the writer is always writing. You know, the writer is always sort of harvesting, gathering, harvesting, putting away, stockpiling, and then moving things around in the memory, pulling things back forward from long ago, filing away, thinking this might be interesting, might be useful, you know. At least that's how I've always worked. So I think that this character, to go back to your question, this character who is very observant, is, you know, I mean, she does represent, I think, the writer's state of mind, any artist's state of mind, really. But I think the writer in particular the writer, the painter, sort of the solitary arts, you know. There's a lot of observing going on. There has to be a lot of watching, a lot of looking.
Yeah, she looks around the city and looks around the environment around the city, the countryside and the castles. She talks about seeing castles. It's very it's a very visual book in that way, although it's all seen through her eyes. I was curious whether, I know that you are living now in the US, but are you moving back to Rome at some point?
I sort of live between
the two?
I haven't technically that much this year for the obvious reasons that it's been very difficult to and ill-advised and impossible to move around. So we have been, for the most part, we have been here in Princeton. I've been in this house for a huge amount of that year. This year, we were able to go back to Rome for a bit over the last summer, and we'll go back now that things are a little less horrible, and we're vaccinated and things like that. But not with not as if everything's fine again, because everything's not fine. Everything's not fine at all. And we know how this pandemic functions, and we realize that, when we see what's happening in other parts of the world, we see what's happening in India right now. It's impossible to say, oh, no problem, I'm just going to go back. But in a, ideally when things are better for everybody, I will resume a life in which I'm both here and there.
Do your kids think of themselves as Italian and American, sort of both? I mean, I'm curious about this question of language and identity and how it plays out. Obviously, it's different for an adult than it is for a child.
I think my kids are very comfortable in Italy. They've been raised in Rome. They've been educated in Rome. My son went to high school in Rome for 2 years. My daughter's going to high school in Rome for 2 years. So, they're used to this, these two worlds. They belong to both worlds. I don't know what they think of in terms of their core identity. I would guess that they consider themselves American, and they are, and they were born in New York City, and they're New Yorkers, really. I think they're proud of that, and they should be. And I think that's their, I mean, who knows what they will say if they hear me. They're teenagers now, so they have very, they've always had their own opinions, of course. But that's my guess. I never felt American. On the other hand, my husband felt American, but didn't feel American because he was raised in Latin America, until he was a teenager. So, but had a family with ties to America. So it's just very complicated. What people want to call themselves. I don't call myself anything anymore, really. I've stopped. I just call myself who I am, and I don't, when people will say, oh, you're this or you're that, you're those things, you're a hyphen, whatever. I mean, whatever they say, it doesn't matter to me anymore, because it's never quite, it's never quite what's really going on. And I think that's part of the reason why I'm exploring writing right now about people without, very obvious labels to kind of pinpoint where people are from, where people are, where exactly people are, those coordinates, right? So in a sense, the Dove mi trovo, where I find myself, is also a very ironic title,
right?
Because we never know where we are in this book. There's no real clue. I mean, one can deduce it's an Italian city. One can peer a little closer and think, oh, maybe this is Rome. One can even peer very closely and identify certain aspects of a certain neighborhood in Rome. And all of that is true, but it also isn't the entire story, right? So again, I think the title Whereabouts, in a way, it's sort of the opposite of Dove mi trovo, because it's, if you think of Dove mi trovo as the, where I find myself, right? Where it implies a where, but it also kind of eludes that at the same time, right? Because where is that where? Is it here or is it somewhere else, right? So no, in that sense, I think the two titles actually are very much in conversation, in spite of their being very different,
Do you think you'll ever write in English again?
I don't know. I have written things in English since my move into Italian, but they haven't been fiction, or they haven't been my creative work. But I have written.
Right.
I've written essays. I've written things like that. Like I wrote that essay on self-translation in English because I thought, and I do a lot more English writing now also because I teach. I teach at Princeton. I give lectures. If I want to communicate some thoughts to students or to a public here, it's better to write it in English, because translation is work.
Yeah.
Translation is a lot of work, and so if I'm asked to give a lecture here, I will write it in English. But the work I'm producing, that is, what I call my creative body of work, is still evolving entirely in Italian, and I've since written 2 other books in Italian, and but I don't know what I will write after all is, after those books come out. I'll have to move on to something else, and I can't say what language it will be in.
Well, now I think maybe we should look at some of these questions that audience members have been sending in. We won't have time to get every single question answered, but I'd like to, somebody named Michael asked, would you elaborate a bit on what you learned from Beckett?
Well, I discovered Beckett when I was 18 in college, my freshman year of college. I took a class called, I think it was called Modern Literature. And it was, I didn't study very much modern literature, contemporary or modern literature at all as an undergraduate. I was very focused on other centuries. I was focused on medieval literature, Renaissance literature. In particular, I read Latin, I studied ancient Greek. I was really in a different place as an undergraduate, but I did take this modern literature course my freshman year of college. And in that course, I read, for the first time, I read Beckett, I read Joyce, I read Nabokov, and I read Conrad, right?
Oh, wow.
4 writers who had very charged relationships with other languages, and 3 of whom who actually wrote in other languages. And I think Joyce is someone who basically reinvented the English language, right? When he moved into writing Ulysses, and then of course Finnegan's Wake. So I was always thinking about those writers, and I thought about Beckett in particular because he did this, this extraordinary thing of writing in French, moving into French, out of English into French, and then translating himself back into English. And he worked, he worked across genre. He was a novelist, he was a playwright, he was a poet. And he did very interesting things when he translated himself back into English out of the French. And I have this amazing book of Beckett's, it's actually in Rome, but it's a trilingual edition of his poems. And so one sees on the same page the French poem, an Italian translation of the poem. Beckett also translated out of Italian. He knew Italian, but they're not his own translations. So there's his French, there's the Italian translation of his French by another writer, and then there are Beckett's translations of himself in English. And it's fascinating because so often the Italian is a more quote unquote faithful rendering of the French, because Beckett was doing all sorts of things as he was moving out of French. And, you know, so I find him an ongoing inspiration and example. And I just feel like I've been studying his work and thinking about it for decades now. And I think he too is someone who sort of reinvented the wheel in some sense in terms of literature. You know, I mean, he did. His entire approach to reality and to language was so extraordinary and new and exciting and terrifying, and in a good way, and inspirational, deeply inspirational to me. So I keep learning. I still learn from Beckett, and now I think I learn. I think I pay more attention to that translation element in Beckett. You know, the self-translation element. Before, I was more focused on maybe just the story, the novels themselves, the plays, what he was really getting at, the themes. You know, I mean, talk about isolation, solitude, the edge. You know, and I in a way, I you know, I have to say, Whereabouts, when I found the title, I thought of Beckett. I thought maybe it sounds kind of Beckettian somehow, this word whereabouts. I feel like he might have used it, maybe.
That's cool. I like that. Somebody named Daniel wants to know, have you ever considered writing in your first language?
In Bengali? Well, I can't. I speak it, right? I speak it, and I never learned how to write it in a way that I could express myself. So I don't have that ability. Unfortunately, I've translated out of Bengali. You know, I've had it read to me and translated. I wrote a master's thesis, which was the translations of a Bengali author. So I have worked with the language as a writer, as a translator, I should say, which is also as a writer. But I myself am not capable of producing work in that language, alas.
Yeah. David wants to know, what prompted your interest in Italian?
Well, that's such a long answer, potentially. Yeah, I think, I mean, the short answer is that it was calling to me, you know, something about it. I don't know, but it was calling to me. And, you know, I went to Italy, I heard Italian, and I wanted to be part of that conversation. It was that simple and that mysterious at the same time.
Well, in the essay that you write about learning Italian, you really use the language of love. You say you had a yearning for it, and you had an infatuation with it, and it sounds like just love at first here, you know.
Yeah, it was like that. I mean, there was that sense of, you know, deep. I mean, I think with Italian there was a sense of, I mean, it was like falling in love in that, you know, you knew you had to be with that person. You knew that person was going to change your life, but you didn't know why. Right? Because when we fall in love with someone, we don't know why we're falling in love with the person, really. Like, we may think, oh, because of the smile or the sense of humor or the whatever, some trait or behavior or something, but it's all so, I mean, we can't fall in love with something we really I think, no. I mean, falling in love always implies something that's sort of beyond you. And I think, is it possible to fall in love with people we think we know very well? So, and that has happened to me. But I still think that it's falling in love is to me, it's discovery, it leads to discovery. And I think so in that sense, yes, I did fall in love with the language. But precisely that because I didn't know exactly what it would do, what it could give me, what it might provide. But I just had that feeling that it would, which is what gave me that impetus, right, to learn it, to study it, to get better at it. But there was no guarantee. I mean, nobody ever said along the way, well, if you study it for a really long time, you'll be able to do X, Y, and Z and write books. And so, I mean, nobody was saying any of that at all. And I think the other thing that was kind of thrilling about studying Italian and becoming more and more dedicated and passionate was that there was nobody telling me to do it at all. It was just totally self-generated. It was just me listening to myself, me wanting to do it. There was no purpose, there was no reason, there was no job, there was no person in my life, there was no, oh, I have to learn it because I don't know, my husband's Italian, or my best friend, or I'm going to Italy for the summer, or I have a job in which I have to speak. There was no practical reason at all for me to learn the language.
I mean, it strikes me that not only was there no reason, you actually brought along your husband and children. Like you had to get other people on board with this with this very interdirected quest to come along with you. Was that hard?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it was a bold move on my part, but I think they saw that, I was taking the train out to Bensonhurst to study with my tutor for 2 hours, every whatever Friday or Thursdays that I went, and doing my homework. And I mean, my husband saw that my kids were pretty young at the time, and I don't think they, really were processed at all what was going on. But my husband realized that this was something that was taking up more and more of my energy. And so when I said to him, listen, I really feel strongly that my Italian is never going to get better unless we move to Italy for a year. And I just really need to, I just need to live there just for a year, just one. And I said, it will be interesting and exciting. And it's, we traveled to Italy a little bit. So, so he said, okay, let's go. And we moved to Rome, and we thought it was going to be for a year. And as I said, that was 9 years ago. And I feel like the past 9 years, Italy has been a constant in my life. Even when I'm living here, Italy is a constant presence in my life. And my life has totally changed because of that 1 year that turned into 2 and then 3. And then even though I, technically moved back here to teach at Princeton, we kept our home, we kept our apartment, we kept up with all of our friendships and all of our, just all of the things we had gotten used to doing. But the main thing was that I continued writing in Italian. I think that was the thing that really made the anchor stay put for me creatively there, and this whole book was written, basically most of it was written on return trips to Italy when I had already moved back to the United States. Though the beginning, I had started it, I'd sort of gotten it off the ground vaguely when I was still living in Rome, but most of it was written on return trips.
There's a question from a woman named Terry that says, do you relish solitude in your life? And then she quotes a line from the book that says, "Solitude demands a precise assessment of time. I've always understood this." Can you expand on that line and concept?
Well, I think as a writer, I know a lot about solitude because that's what I do. And there's no way to be a writer without having a relationship with solitude. Well, I mean, I think that's not true. I think you can't be a writer without experiencing solitude. But then I think it's one thing to experience solitude and another thing to actually have a relationship with solitude, to understand what it is. And I think solitude is, on the one hand, it's a relationship with this concept called solitude. But I think what it really is being able to acknowledge having a relationship with yourself. And not in a, I don't mean that in a sort of narcissistic, self-involved way, but rather just understanding that you can be with yourself and learn from yourself and entertain yourself and question yourself and all of these things that you might do with another person as well. But I think solitude, having a relationship with solitude makes me understand that I'm not just one person, and that I am another person. I am the other, right? That idea of like I am the other, which is so radical for the surrealists, right? Je suis l'autre. But I think there's that. I think that's fundamental to everybody to understand that idea, that the other is you.
This next question kind of dovetails on the idea of solitude, or sort of the practical difficulty of finding it sometimes. Tanya says, "So many women struggle to balance career with family. How has being a writer and raising a family impacted you, especially during this time of pandemic?"
Well, I mean, I certainly experienced the challenges of trying to write and raise my children, which when my children were small, really until we moved to Rome, I was taking care of my children with some help, not a lot, a little bit, enough so that I could write. But I was very aware of it. I was very aware of exactly how much time I had to myself in those years, because I had two kids and they needed me, and I wanted to be there as much as I could for them. And then we moved to Rome, and my kids were still kids. I mean, my son was 10, my daughter was 7, turning 8 that year. And that year my husband took a year off. And so that really changed the whole dynamic at home, right? Because suddenly he was there and he was able to do things that he normally wasn't able to do in the course of the day, like give them lunch or whatever, just like some basic thing that, I mean, I remember when I was, when I published my earlier books, and would have to do a presentation or just one thing somewhere. We lived in Brooklyn, so just like one evening event in Manhattan, and if my husband was working late, I remember it was like so complicated, right? Just to like get out of the house and put on something respectable and like make sure my hair was combed, and were the kids, had they been fed, and did they have to have their bath, and the babysitter, and this and that. I mean, there were so many things to think about. And so that's really changed, because my kids are much older now. So this pandemic year, we've been taking care of them in other ways, because my son was supposed to go to college and he couldn't, and he studied from home all year. My daughter went to school I don't know. I feel like she's been to school like maybe 30 days in the entire year of her sophomore year of high school. So there are different issues. I mean, you're always parents, right? You never stop being a parent. And this year has been so challenging for everybody. But for them, you know, as teenagers, as young adults. And so I feel like a lot more emotional energy, you know, we have to invest, and just the presence, and making sure we sit together at the table and eat and things like that. But you know, logistically, I'm much freer. So if I say to my kids, I'm going to go to the library for 4 or 5 hours, see you later, they're like, okay, you know. I mean,
Right.
but,
Yeah.
but that's a totally different reality from having smaller kids, you know. So I can only imagine what it was like, what it's been like for parents who have younger children during the pandemic.
Yeah. Laura wants to know if you have a favorite between the Italian version and the English version.
I don't. I really don't. I've never been able to have a favorite among any of the books in general. And these are, I mean, on the one hand, it's the same book, and on the other hand, they're two different books, you know. I mean, the book, to me, the book is the Italian book, right? And then this is another manifestation of the book. And but it grew out of, you know, it began where it began.
Laura also says she's studying Italian and she wants to read the books side by side. And she wonders, do you know if it's easy to get the Italian, to get Dove Mi Trove around here?
You can probably get it at Rizzoli, at Rizzoli Bookstore in New York.
Oh yeah, good point.
They would carry it, or they would certainly be able to order it, because they have, you know, they have relationships with all of the Italian publishers. So in the US, I think that would be a place to get it. I always encourage people to go to bookstores to get it. One can also order from Amazon. Amazon Italia. They and once in a while I have had to resort to that to get a book here that I needed desperately. But the obvious answer, and I feel that it is appropriate to reiterate on this occasion, is go to the library. And many libraries may have the book. I know any academic library would have it. I mean, I shouldn't be so, you know, good. I don't know if every academic, but I mean, like, for example, the Princeton Library has it, right? So I imagine some academic libraries out there will have it. Yeah.
Nice. Marcia asks, how has immersion in Italian language and culture changed your attitudes and ways of thinking?
Totally changed. I mean, it's just a different reality, different way of thinking, different way of being, different way of coping, you know, different way of expressing myself. So many things are very, very different in Italian. But again, I already knew that because I was raised between, like, you know, between two different languages. And so I always knew that, you know, the Bengali reality was very different from the English reality, you know. And it wasn't just the language, it was everything. Everything was different. Everything was different. And the same, you know. I mean, there's so many things that are that bind us, right? That we all feel and do and crave and fear, right? We are connected in so many ways, in spite of our linguistic and cultural differences. But at the same time, it is extraordinary, this you know, the presence of the existence of diverse languages and cultures. You know, it's one of the most extraordinary things about our human race. One of its biggest resources, I think. One of the richest aspects, I would imagine, if one were to come in from another planet and observe what we were all about,
That's really interesting. I mean, that diversity, of course, is our strength, but it's also often seen as a problem. I'm curious about your own self-identity as a person who's moved between cultures and between languages and between places. Do you see yourself as an immigrant mother? Do you feel solidarity with other immigrants, or do you see yourself? I mean, I'm curious just how that plays out in such a political moment as we are living in now.
I was raised by immigrants, right? So I don't call myself an immigrant, though I technically did leave the United Kingdom at the age of 2 and arrive in America. I don't call myself an immigrant in that sense, nor did I ever call myself an American. I wasn't an American. I was naturalized as an American citizen when I was 18. I had a green card along with my parents until then. And I was part of them, but I knew that they were the ones who had left home, not me, because I didn't have the same relationship with India for the obvious reasons that they did. So, do I call myself an immigrant? No, not really, because my experience of life and my consciousness, my upbringing, my formation was in this country. And though it was informed by my parents and their world and their relationship and their status as immigrants and their life and their perspective as immigrants, it wasn't what I was. And I think part of what drove me to write was to understand the journey that they had made, and so many of my early stories and novels are really exploring that, because I didn't know firsthand what that meant at all. I didn't know. I only intuited. I only heard the stories. I only observed what it was like, but I didn't do it, right? When I moved to Italy, I did move to another country with my kids, and I had to learn, sort of new ways to do things, new ways to get on a bus and whatever. But I did all of that, out of, sort of, I was incredibly, I was totally, this was totally a choice on my part. It wasn't, I wasn't moving to Italy to better my life. Well, I improved my life enormously in moving to Italy, but in another way. I didn't go to Italy to make my life. I didn't go to Italy for the same reasons my father left India. It's different. I didn't go to Italy saying, this because I'm going to give my children a better life. In that sense, in that sort of, hard socioeconomic sense of, the opportunities are better, these things, these big driving factors that make people, that inspire people to move, to take that kind of leap. I went because I wanted to. I went because I wanted to get better at Italian, and yes, it did improve my life in enormous ways that I'd never expected. But I knew that I could always go back. I knew that the minute we didn't like this, this Italian experiment, this year in Italy, that we could just pack up and go. But the reality was that I fell in love with it. I love my life there. I love Rome. I feel so grateful that I discovered that city and the country in general, and it's been totally transformative for me, and I think in some sense for my family as well. My kids choosing to study there, and so on. So it's been a family experience, but I think for me it's been just profoundly transformative. And so what I do when I'm in Italy, though, is that I do observe a lot of immigrants in Italy. I'm really interested in immigrants to Italy, and I feel, I feel kind of, I see a lot of similar, I recognize a lot of things when I see immigrant communities in Italy and how they function and how they fare, how they cope, the challenges they face. Some of the new stories I'm writing look at those questions. Yeah.
Another question, and I think I'll just do two more. Patricia wants to know, when did you first feel that you could think in Italian?
That's an interesting question. I think, I think I was training myself to think in Italian because I started writing in my diary in Italian. Because writing in my diary is thinking, right? You're thinking to yourself and sort of writing down the words that are in your head. And I've kept a diary for decades. And so it is my way of thinking, it's how, some people think out loud, some people talk to themselves. So I write in my diary, right? When I really want to think about something, I write it down in a notebook. And so I think that was when it started, it was the fact that I was writing things, observing things, whatever. And I think so. I think it started there, but then it gained speed. It gained momentum. It gained substance. So by the time I sat down to write that story, some months later, I was thinking in Italian, obviously.
And Joanne wants to know, and I hope this is a good question. It's a question I always think about when I think about Italy, which is, did you learn how to cook in Italy? And do you cook Italian food?
I learned how to cook Italian food long before I moved to Italy, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I had lots of examples of people who, whether they were Italian Americans or just ambitious cooks, talented cooks. But I was exposed to a lot of Italian cuisine in my sort of adult life, and then I also I learned. I bought books, I watched shows, and I liked it I liked the food very much. And then I would go to Italy now and then, so I would taste things and I would want to replicate them. And so I knew how to cook Italian food before I moved there. I think now that I've lived in Italy, and now that I live in Italy, off again and on again. But what has changed is that I now know how to cook Italian food in a completely different way. Like, I never look at a cookbook. I never, I just, I cook in a completely more instinctive way, the way my mother cooked, right? She would just, she collected recipe books and things as well. And she studied recipes. She was an amazing cook. A gifted cook. And but I think now when I go, I actually, in my pantry in Rome, I have one cookbook, and that's an Indian cookbook, because sometimes I invite Italian friends over and I make them Indian food, and there's some recipes I need to still study when I make certain things. I can also make Indian food just così, from my head. But more and more, all of my cooking is now like that. Though I do have to make my son his birthday cake in 2 days, and I have to like pour over the recipe, because I definitely cannot bake from scratch. I have to know exactly how many eggs.
Yeah, baking is a science.
Yes,
it requires much more careful, calibrations and whatnot. Well, I think we should end it there. I don't know if Ariel comes back on now. Here
Yeah.
she does. Here she is. Thank you so much, Jhumpa. This was a really fun conversation.
It was for me as well. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your questions and the audience questions, and yeah, it was a fun talk. Thank you. Thank you so much for supporting the book.
Well, thank you both so much for coming on and for having this thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation, and for making me madly desirous of eating Italian and Indian food now. It's like all you have to do is mention it.
They are two great cuisines.
They are two great cuisines. And most of all, I want to thank everybody in the audience actually too, for coming, because as I always say, without you, we're nothing. And so I want to remind everybody that Whereabouts is available for sale by our partner, Watch on Booksellers, and that it's also available to borrow through the library. And that though we at the library are all about giving it away, that we ask, if you care about our authors and you care about our programs, that you consider buying their books and supporting them, because that's the most sincere compliment you can actually pay an author in some ways, is to want to own their books. And I feel that way more now than ever, now that I'm a librarian and I can just go into a library. And if you can't get enough of Jhumpa Lahiri and Whereabouts, you're in luck, because there are still a few spaces left in my Zoom book club meeting about Whereabouts, which will take place next Thursday, May 13th at 7 p.m. And then finally, so just you can go on the library website and sign up. Finally, we hope you'll join us for our next event, which is the finale of our season, with Pulitzer Prize winning, I should say two-time Pulitzer Prize winning former New York Times journalist Barry Meyer on Thursday, May 20th at 7 p.m. And he'll be talking about his new book, Spooked, The Trump Dossier, Black Cube, and The Rise of Private Spies, with Mike Isikoff, the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News. So be well, and we'll hope to see you next time. And thanks again, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Be well. Support your library.